Greetings, friends. This is the first of two videos on t-tests and ANOVAs. In this part of the course, we are going to be starting to cover what are called inferential statistics. Last week we worked on descriptive statistics, which are mean, median, and mode, standard deviation, and so on. This week and the next several weeks, we're going to be talking about what are called inferential statistics. And these are powerful statistical operations that allow you to draw conclusions about larger groups based on the sampling of a much smaller group. So we can make judgments, or not judgments, but at least informed judgments about what a large group of people who share common characteristics might think or feel or be able to do based on a smaller sample than sampling the entire population. So you can, during a presidential year, ask 600 or 700 or 800 people how they're going to vote, and from that group have a fairly reasonable idea, if you sample correctly, what the voting patterns of several million people might be like. So in working on inferential statistics, there are basically two fundamental ways in which inferential statistics are used. The first one is one we're going to be studying here, the differences between groups. And the second one, which we'll be starting to cover next week, is the relationship between variables. Differences between groups, the common statistical work that we'll be doing is t-tests and ANOVAs. And relationships between variables we'll be working on next week, and that's correlations and regressions. What t-tests are a way to see what the fundamental or foundational or inferential differences are between two groups. In order to be able to do that, each individual in the group that you are taking a look at must be named or identified, and also there must be some kind of a scale or ordinal variable that will generate the data that you'll be using for the comparisons. So, for example, if you are going to be studying the differences between freshmen and sophomores, the freshman and sophomore classification will be the nominal variable. If you wanted to study how they perform on a particular assessment, that's the scale variable that you'll be using. If you want to talk about the difference between men and women on a particular scale, the men and women classification would be the nominal variable, and the scale variable would be whatever it is that you're testing their attitudes, their dispositions, their performance on some kind of a measurement. We talked about this last week, how scores are generated, so just going to go ahead and briefly go over this again. For our statistical work, most of the time that we'll be working with data will be data that you will have generated through some kind of a score on some kind of an instrument. It may be a test of some kind or a survey or some way that you're going to collect the information, and go ahead and then you'll collect those scores. We talked about how you can take those scores, and if you were to organize those scores, then the individuals that you were taking a look at, the distribution of those scores would most likely, in most cases at least, the distribution would look like a bell curve. We said last week that you don't need to sample everybody in that population in order to be able to understand what that distribution might be and what the mean score might be. As long as you had a decent enough sample size of the population, you'd be able to infer what the entire group would look like if you were to go ahead and collect information from everybody in that population group. So let's say that we were going to sample what attitudes were of individuals at a football game. We wouldn't necessarily have to sample all 100,000 people. We could take a sample out of this fan base and take a sample out of this fan base. And if we plotted the distribution of the attitudes, dispositions, or scores of those two groups, each of those would yield a bell curve. And if there was a difference between those two groups, it would graphically look like this. So what we are interested in is to see what the differences might be on a particular instrument between two groups. Here we have identified group 1 and group 2. Here's the mean score of these two groups, and what we are wanting to take a look at is to see if there is a statistically significant difference between these two groups. And in order to determine whether or not that difference is statistically significant, there has to be less than a 5% chance that the difference between those two groups is due to chance. So we'll talk about how to determine that in just a moment. So again, we want to see the mean scores, see if the mean scores between two groups identify if there's a statistically significant difference between the mean score between two groups. Now there are two different types of t-tests, independent samples t-tests and paired samples t-tests, and all that means is what kind of a group are you going to be sampling? Is the group consisted of two different kinds of individuals, or two different individuals, excuse me, or is it the same group being tested twice? With independent samples t-tests, you are taking a look at two different groups. One group, in this case the green group, in this case the blue group, and you want to see if there's a statistically significant difference between these two groups. The paired samples t-tests is to see if there's any difference between a group at one point and a group at another. Oftentimes we call that a pre and post test. So a paired samples t-test is the difference between what a group was before instruction or before some kind of intervention and what they were like afterwards. So again, these are the two basic kinds of independent samples t-tests, or two types of t-tests, independent samples and paired samples. So that's the basics of it. There are a couple ways that we could illustrate how that works. The first one is, imagine that if you were working on a particular curriculum innovation and you decided to test students in the spring. That should be spring, actually. I'll go ahead and change that right here. You decide to test one group of students in the spring using the old curriculum and another using a newer, more innovative curriculum. Both groups perform at the same levels last semester. You would use a independent samples t-test. You have two groups that you are taking a look at. They are independent of each other. They have no connection with each other. On the second scenario, if you're going to test a particular kind of intervention, maybe attitudes towards bullying, you tested attitudes at the beginning of the intervention, and at the end, that would be a paired samples t-test. Same group before and after the treatment, or before and after the intervention. So one of the things that we want to start looking at is to see whether or not you would use not only this sample, or this research method, or the other quantitative methodology, or if you really are set up to do a qualitative study. And on Moodle I have, you'll see this sheet that you can download and take a look at. And what this does is helps you start to identify reasons why you might choose quantitative or qualitative methodologies. Basically, what it does is it comes down as to what you're trying to accomplish with your study. Now, there is something to be said for whether or not you're a, quote, a qual person or a quant person. People gravitate towards one or the other, and that oftentimes affects their choice. But also, you need to take a look at the purpose of the study. If you're a person trying to look at the uncovering motives or a deep understanding of a perspective, then qualitative certainly lends itself to that kind of an investigation. If you are looking to make an inference about a large population group, then qualitative doesn't work very well for you. You'd have to have such a large sample of a population in order to be able to generalize from that. Now, you can use quantitative from a small sample size, but your ability to generalize, to make inferences about larger population groups, is certainly limited with a small sample size. One of the big differences, though, is the purpose of the study. If you are, you need to justify a choice to a board of directors or to a principal or to a school board, hard evidence, what we call hard evidence, quantitative research certainly is a research methodology that lends itself more to that. So there's some other variables here, or other characteristics of quantitative and qualitative that you may want to look at as you're beginning to make your decision about what kind of research methodology that you are going to choose for your study.